As we read through the Old Testament, we encounter God having to deal with people, often in ways that seem quite harsh and demanding. It makes it easy for us to wonder, what does God really want? He seems to spend so much time threatening or cajoling or punishing. What is it he wants? Actually, in the ancient world, the people spent a good deal of time with these sorts of questions. How can I figure out what this particular God wants? I want to bring an offering to this deity to keep from being punished and to be granted good fortune. For most of human history, human beings have been trying to appease the gods. But what does God want? There seem to be such dire consequences for some bad behavior, while other misdeeds almost appear to go unnoticed. In a moment of understandable frustration and irritation, Moses strikes a rock and is barred entry into the promised land, while his brother Aaron, who famously said the golden calf he had handcrafted had just popped out of the fire, remained a prince in Israel for decades. So what does God want? Unquestioning obedience, or unswerving loyalty, or unending sacrifice? I know it's difficult to narrow it down to only one thing, but I think Joshua in chapter 24 gives us a good glimpse into one of the most fundamental answers. And it begins in verse 2, when God reminds his people that they weren't always his people. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, lived beyond the Euphrates River, and they worshipped other gods. Something that's easy for us to forget as we read through the scriptures, where Abraham is revered as the patriarch of God's chosen people, is that he wasn't born a Jew. Abraham grew up in a pagan, idolatrous home with parents who worshipped heathen gods. Not surprisingly, there are several Jewish legends that suggest Abraham grew up serving Yahweh, even though he was surrounded by idol worshippers. One such legend goes like this. Abram's father, Terah, was an idol maker with his own shop. One day, Terah had some business to do, so he left Abram in charge. While his father was gone, Abram took the biggest idol and set him in the middle of the floor. Next, he put all the other idols in a circle around the biggest idol. Then Abram took a hammer and, after smashing all the smaller idols, put the hammer in front of the big one that was still standing. When Terah came home, he was angry and asked Abram why he had smashed all the idols. Abram explained it wasn't him who did it. It was the one large idol with the hammer in front of it. Terah became even angrier, and he said, Abram, you know that idol is nothing but a statue, and it can't do anything like that. Abram answered, yes, Father, that is true. But if they can't do anything, why do we make and sell them for people to worship as gods? Well, that's a nice story. But God called Abram to leave that pagan environment in which he grew up. And in Joshua, God reminded his people that their heritage was one rooted in idol worship, not faithful commitment to him. So, what about these pagan gods? Did the gods of the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Chaldeans and the Sumerians and the Egyptians, did they share any characteristics with one another? Well, to begin with, all the religions of these nations were polytheistic. No one God had the power to rule all the parts of the universe. In many of the religions, the universe was divided into the heavens or the sky, the earth, and the underworld. It took a joint effort to control all of creation. Another thing is that all the gods were feared, not loved. They were all distant. They were removed from the lives and worries of their worshipers. One dared not fail to observe the proper rites at the appropriate times. Service to these gods was mandatory, and if one failed, there would be dire consequences. Many of the gods were not trustworthy, but were unpredictable and capricious. They not only looked like humans, but they behaved like them as well, fighting with one another, seducing one another, and displaying their cruel nature, sometimes even by demanding human sacrifice in their rituals. They may have created mankind, but the purpose of humans was to serve the gods. As God continued the history of the Israelites, even after he had established his people through the family of Abraham, they hadn't remained faithful to him. In the land of Egypt, they had worshipped Osiris and Isis and Ra. Still, God hadn't left them in either physical or spiritual bondage. Instead, he freed his people and brought them through the Red Sea to the Promised Land. And now with the current generation, God continued that there were still many idols to choose from in Canaan. Baal was considered the most powerful. They might no longer be subservient to the Chaldean gods, such as Anu or Ea, but they would still be confronted by the Amorite gods, like Marduk and Astarte. They would still have the same opportunity for their idolatry as their ancestors had before them. Through Joshua, God reminded them of all God had done for them, and then instructs them, so serve the Lord wholeheartedly. Put away forever the idols your ancestors worshipped, and serve the Lord alone. And then Joshua concluded, as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. So, how does God compare to those of other nations? Well, for one thing, he is the only God. He is all they need. He also wants to be like a father to them, not distant, but concerned about them as individuals, about their joys and their sorrows. He wants their love, not fear. And he can always be trusted completely. He does, however, want one fundamental thing from them. He has to be chosen as their God. As intelligent beings with the power to think and to do, he has given them and us the power and the freedom to ultimately be able to choose either for him or against him, without any fear of retaliation. Our decision to worship him and none other must be made individually, without force or coercion. Hundreds of years later, the Apostle Paul explains in more detail the kind of God he has chosen to love and to follow. Paul is in Athens and sees an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." Speaking to the men of Athens, he says, "You men of Athens, I perceive that you are very religious in all things. For as I passed along, I observed the objects of your worship, and I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I announce to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, he, the Lord of heaven and earth, doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing that he himself gives to all life and breath. He made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the surfaces of the earth, that they should seek the Lord, if perhaps they might reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. Being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, that it is engraved by art or by the design of man. There were times of ignorance, and God overlooked those. But now, he commands that all people everywhere should repent. But the people that Joshua is speaking to don't live in a civilization as advanced as the one where Paul resides. It is true that in the Old Testament, God sometimes acts like a parent who expects the compliance of his children. Chastisements made to them are made out of love. God, like earthly parents, wants those children to grow up with strong moral values and with the ability to think for themselves. Only then will they have the maturity and the ability to do that. Only then will they have the maturity to choose the path their lives will take. And like loving fathers everywhere, God hopes they will choose to love him in return.